When Emily Carrington was about 15 years old, she experienced sexual abuse from a much older man. Much later, she discovered graphic novel memoirs and then created her own, called Our Little Secret, in which she recounts the abuse based on diaries she kept at the time, and also describes dealing with the trauma after the fact. The book went on to win the Lynd Ward Graphic Novel Prize. This week she talks with Koom about turning this trauma into a graphic novel to help others in similar situations to deal with their own trauma. This episode does contain references to childhood trauma and childhood sexual abuse. First, we're glad to see an increase in listenership recently, and we hope you'll help that to continue. So please tell your friends about us, share episodes on social media, and also send us suggestions for topics we could cover. Email us at mail@deconstructingcomics.com. This is Tim, and this is Deconstructing Comics.
This is Koom for Deconstructing Comics in Toronto, and I am talking to Emily Carrington on Gabriola Island, I believe.
That's correct, yep. Out on the west coast of Canada.
Awesome. So how did you end up on Gabriola?
Oh, well, I just kept drifting west until I hit the ocean, basically. I'm from the east coast of Canada, and in the mid-1980s, when I was in my late teens, there was very little work back on Prince Edward Island, where I'm from. It was a struggle to even find a job like grading potatoes in a warehouse, or working in the fields picking blueberries, and so not just me, but a lot of Maritimers ended up going out west. Basically, it was out west. So you just went west until you found a job. So first it was Alberta. I worked on a beef farm, a sheep farm, doing lambing in the middle of winter and calving. And then went back home and ran out of money again and went out west, except this time I went a bit further, ended up going over the mountains to British Columbia, and just absolutely fell in love with the West Coast. Love the Gulf Islands. I did a bike ride around Salt Spring Island. The creativity was just the wonderful. It was beautiful. It was springtime. There were blossoms on the trees. And so over the next few years, I ended up going back and forth a few more times until eventually I just decided to settle out west, and found that the Gulf Islands were, first of all, slightly less expensive at the time, less expensive place to live, and also had a wonderful creative type of an atmosphere with lots of potters, artists, writers, and people who love nature. So I guess I stayed, and then over time, time goes by, and you just end up someplace, and then you don't leave.
Right.
So I just kind of ended up out here.
Yeah, I visited some of those islands for the first time 2 years ago, and they are really lovely.
Yes, they are. Yes.
So I usually start off by asking people how they got into comics or cartooning. Your book is your very first one, Our Little Secret. And from what I'm gathering, did you do any mini comics or little stories and anthologies or anything like that? Or did you just kind of come to comics fairly late?
Well, I loved comics when I was a kid. Sort of the setting, if you might want to call it that, is the Maritime provinces in Canada, which are in a rural areas. So back there, it's a wonderful place. There's a lot of community and friendliness and wonderful people, but they're not so much interest in the arts. So in Prince Edward Island, there really wasn't much of an art college, and in the library there weren't very many books apart from the standard things like Tintin and Asterix, which are sort of what I grew up on. So when I sort of grew out of I shouldn't say grow out of, but when life got kind of busy as a teenager, and there was nothing else but the kind of Tintin and Asterix, and my parents were going through a messy divorce. I sort of drifted away from comics for a long time, as in 35 years. So incredibly long time, until it just started to come back. Just this interest, like a little interest that just grew and grew, just slowly over the period of about a year or so. And I ended up taking some courses. And at that time, I went to the library out here, of course, at a college that teaches comics. And of course, they had lots of books, lots of graphic novels and comics. I finally discovered.
Were you already on the West Coast at this point?
Yes. It was already on the West Coast. And this was actually just before the pandemic. So, 2019 roughly. And read for the very first time a graphic novel memoir, which was Blankets. And when I read Blankets, I realized it wasn't like a flash of inspiration or anything, but I read it and I said, this is the kind of thing I want to do. I want to do memoir.
Right.
This is really appealing to me. So I started reading everything I could get my hands on. And then, so up until 2019, I didn't know that graphic novel memoirs existed. So I basically took out every book that I could get my hands on and just read all the time, and had this feeling like I had 35 years to catch up on. I was reading like somebody who had 35 years to catch up on as quickly as they could, because I really felt that this was my medium. And so, yeah, that's a very long route. And I feel like I missed out on a lot, because you hear stories about how people, they start with, they're a teen or a young person. They start with mini comics, they go through all the stages of life, and they're drawing and do this. And I came to comics. I was thinking about this the other day. I came to comics as somebody who, in a way, had skipped all of that and had come to it as I almost think of it as you have your childhood, your adolescence, your adulthood, and then you sort of become what you might call an elder, or the age where you'd be a grandparent, and you're not out doing adventures anymore. You're more looking back on life and thinking about the next generation rather than your own adventures. So I'm starting in comics from, I think, a very different place than most people do.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons I liked your book, was because you examined your topic, which is sexual abuse, specifically sexual abuse of teens, so thoroughly. And I think if you had done that in your 30s and did a memoir about that experience, you might not have processed it as thoroughly as you have in this book. And so I think if I have to pick one thing I like the most about your book, it's how thoroughly you unpack that experience and that topic. But just before I forget, I did notice on page 92, after the experience has begun, you've got this like facsimile of a notebook page where yourself as a teen, because you can't tell anybody about what you're going through, you draw about it. Now, I figured that was you drawing in the present, something to represent what you drew back when you were about 15 or however old you were when you were going through it. I don't think that was actually a page that you kept from that time. But the question I'm coming to is, you obviously did draw back then, and you could have drawn comics, or maybe in some kind of inchoate way, you were drawing things that were proto-comics, because it kind of looks like the thing a cartoonist would draw.
Well, I just opened up my book here so I could figure out which one page 92 was. So page 92 is a full page drawing on a lined loose leaf sheet of paper, and it's done with a blue ballpoint pen, and it shows a few different images. It's got at the bottom, me kneeling down with my head in my hands and reaching forwards, and a chain on my foot. There's shadowy figures in the background that are obviously intimately involved. There's a few other drawings in there, as well as a picture of me with a target on my head, and a picture of me leaned over with the weight of the world on. And that picture came from my diary. So I did draw that back in 1982, I believe.
So you kept the original diary?
Yes.
Okay.
I had the original diary and that drawing. And yes, it is something a cartoonist could do or would do. And the thing is I didn't realize I've been a cartoonist all along. It's just that I didn't know it. And that's why I sort of, this feeling that I had to catch up. I did a couple of comics when I was much younger, like a couple of pages each, but nobody ever said I was a cartoonist, or it looked, they called it drawings, but I didn't know I was a cartoonist. I had no idea.
Well, I'm a little bit younger than you, but even when I was a kid, it wasn't exactly something that was encouraged. It was something that was discouraged because comics were, And then you do mention Scott McCloud's book, Understanding Comics, in your memoir. I think for a lot of us, that was like a kind of a validation or a flag that was planted that said, this could be an abstract medium of sophistication that used its own language. I mean, he wasn't the first to say that, but I think it codified it so well. And in an odd way, your own memoir, once again, coming back to how thoroughly you unpack the process of abuse, sort of in some ways codifies things. I don't know if you've kind of realize that consciously, but in the same way that Scott McCloud, not just in Understanding Comics, but in all three of his books, just breaks everything down into these are the 7 types of whatever, or the 7 steps to, you sort of do that too, isolate the victim, gain the trust of the victim, groom the victim, etc., and so on. Yeah.
Well, yes. As part of the course I took, I mean, this book would not have existed without the courses. It might have existed somehow, but it wouldn't exist as it is at all without the courses I took, and at Langara College in Vancouver. But so bringing up Scott McCloud, he was his books were some of the required reading, and so before starting the book, I was aware, and I found it fascinating. I found his books utterly fascinating. And some of the choices that I made in how I drew were based directly on what I learned from Scott McCloud's books. So
they're amazing. I've used them with students, and I'm just in awe of them.
Oh, yes. I think it's the number one. If you had to say, what book do you need to read to understand comics, it would be Understanding Comics.
And not just that, it's a magical book. I still feel like my heart fly when you should reach out to him if you haven't already, because I think he would be touched by the influence he's had on you. I know his wife passed away, if I'm not misremembering correctly, some years ago, and I haven't really heard much about him, but I think he would appreciate it if you got in touch through his website.
That's a great idea. I'll do that.
Yeah. Other books I was wondering about, did you look at other books on sexual abuse, and think about your book in relation to them? 2 I'm thinking about are Ducks by Kate Beaton, which is getting a lot of press right now, and then a book that's kind of much older is The Tale of One Bad Rat by Brian Talbot.
I did. Now, Ducks came out very recently, so of course I didn't read that before I wrote my book. The books that influenced me before I wrote my book, The Tale of One Bad Rat was one of them. I read that. the one that stood out the most to me actually was not even a graphic novel. It was called, I believe it's called I Am Nobody by Greg Gilhooly. And that was the single most influential book for me in writing my book because of his bravery. He was not afraid of saying anything when he wrote his book. Have you read that book yourself?
No, I haven't heard of it. And once again, this is a memoir of just words, no pictures,
Yes,
right?
yes, that's correct. But even so, it was my number one influence because he was not afraid to name his abuser. He wasn't afraid to say what happened, and he wasn't afraid to explore with great detail and fearlessness, I guess you could call it, everything that happened and an analysis of his life and how the things connected. I found that every single thing he said resonated with me. Now, I have yet to find a graphic novel that did the same thing. I've read graphic novels that talk about it, but they've not talked about it to the depth that Greg Gilhooly's book, I Am Nobody. I'd highly recommend it to anybody who wants to understand about the abuse itself and also the legal system, because Greg Gilhooly, apart from being a hockey player, he was also a lawyer. So he understood the legal system, and even so, he was, let's just say, not satisfied with the outcome.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, and I was just going to mention that some graphic novels that helped me and influenced me with before writing the book. One would have been A Child's Life by Phoebe Glockner. Is that how you say her name?
I think
Child's
so.
Life.
I have read that. Yeah.
Yes. So that was a big one. She talks about it quite a bit in her book, but I felt like she could have gone further. There was,
Well, I think
yeah,
also that one, it's very it's very gray about the topic. If it's the same book I'm thinking about, I think it's vaguely autobiographical, but it's technically fiction. And it's about growing up in San Francisco in the 70s. And then the protagonist ends up interacting with the mom's boyfriend as a way of kind of competing with the mom in some way. Like it's not quite the same as yours, if I'm remembering correctly, at least the way Phoebe's interpreting it.
yes, that's the book I'm thinking of, and I think that's why I think for me I like the book, but as somebody who had been through it, I would have liked her to have gone further in the fact that she sort of in the book takes on, to me, clearly the man who she was interacting with was a predator, and yet in the book she portrays herself a little bit as it being partly her fault, or that she was, in control of the situation. And I think that's when you're going through it, you do feel like you know what's going on and you're in control of the situation. You don't understand that the person who's vastly older and is as in the case with myself, is the person who's actually looking after you and not an actual parent, but in a parental role. You don't understand that they hold all the cards and all the power, and that you don't have any, except you're basically powerless. And I think with A Child's Life, I think I felt like the author still was blaming herself a little bit for what happened, and that's the part where I wished she'd gone a bit further with that.
If I'm remembering what I've read of Phoebe's work, which I read not even years ago, but decades ago, she probably would disagree with you. I think she takes like a different, or she did at the time she did that and other strips, kind of took a different approach to the subject matter. But I agree with you. I mean, I do think it should be something more clear. And your book, I mean, one of the things you mentioned was the legal aspect of it.
Yes.
And the last section, or like a full third of it, is really about you as an adult trying to contend legally with seeing your predator again, and then legally trying to take him to task for it, and the frustrations. And at first, the lawyer that you hire, who unfortunately is not living where you're living at the time, kind of takes advantage of you, or at least that's the way I interpreted it.
Yes.
He assures you he's doing things, but he's not. And in the end, he
Yes.
misses the window. Do you ever did you ever like conclusively for yourself figure out why he did that?
Well, first of all, I'll just explain what the window is. In Canada, and I'm not a lawyer, but as far as I know, when you are when you realize, when the realization comes to you that you've been abused, sexually abused, that's when the clock starts ticking. The moment you wake up and go, aha, this person abused me, they harmed me. When you realize that, it doesn't have to be right after it happens. For me, it was decades later. When I realized that, that's when the clock started ticking, and that's when I think it's the statute of limitations, I think it's called, starts. So when I realized that, now it depends where it happens. In, I believe, every province except for Quebec and Prince Edward Island, there is no statute of limitations, so it doesn't matter. But because the crime happened in Prince Edward Island, as soon as I saw Richard again and realized what happened, that's when the clock started ticking. So my lawyer then had 2 years from that moment to get a claim started. So that's what the window of opportunity is. And it wasn't until about 3 years after that I realized that things were over, that he'd actually done nothing. So why did he do that? I never got an answer, of course, because he's not going to tell me why he didn't do it. His lawyer told me that he apologized to me for it, and I just wasn't going to accept it. I'm sorry. I just, at that point, I was just so disappointed and so angry that I was like, sorry, I'm not accepting it. But he did, through his lawyer, he apologized. I suspect that he had some mental health issues because it turns out that, and I found out this information from the Law Society, that I made a complaint to the Law Society, but between the time I complained and the time they actually started an investigation, it was over a year later. And I think it was about 14 months later. And I'm sorry if I get those numbers wrong. It's been quite a few years now. But there were at least 27 different instances that they listed in their report where he had screwed up somehow, whether it was taking funds and doing nothing, borrowing money from his clients. Just the list went on and on. So there were dozens of people who were in my position. And he voluntarily resigned and was not permitted he's still resigned, and he's not permitted to reapply for 7 years after this whole thing. So and he claimed in his, when he voluntarily resigned, that he had some alcohol issues or something. But the thing that disappointed me the most was that the Law Society told me that this wasn't his first time. And I was very, very disappointed at how much time it took from when I brought this to their attention. It was obvious repeat of what he'd done before. They didn't start investigating for well over a year. And so many, many other people apart from myself were victimized. I lost my chance to to face my abuser in court. So now I can never do that. The statute of limitations is over. So that was very difficult to come to terms with, was that after everything I'd been through, after all the time, that I was not ever going to get a chance to face my abuser and stand up and say, in front of everybody, this is what you did to me. And that felt like being silenced again, except now I was being silenced by the legal system.
I'm really sorry for what you've gone through.
Yeah, it was not fun. I'll describe it as not fun.
Well, I was thinking, besides the primary abuse by Richard, you've got this kind of legal abuse much later by a male lawyer. And then before the time with Richard, you establish what it was like living with your father, especially after your parents separated, and how dysfunctional and difficult that could be because of his quirks. And sort of there seems to be this kind of pattern of where men have just either let you down or set up the stage, enabled Richard, whether it's legally or parentally, for somebody like Richard to perpetrate the abuse and the harm that he did.
Yes. Gosh, there's a lot to think about in that. I think the main thing to say is for the few men who have abused me in my life, there's been hundreds that haven't. And there have been just as many men in my life as women who have helped me through this. In fact, I would say, actually, I haven't stopped to count it, but it's not something I thought about before, actually. But taking a quick look, just thinking back now, I feel like they're at pivotal, critical points of my life. There have actually been many more men that have been there to help me through this than women. Now, that's just to say that I think that the things that happened were perpetrated by men, but it may be those things, the things in the book, but it may be more that in our society, it's more often men that are in positions of power. And it's more an abuse of power, I think, than anything, because what's noticeably lacking, I think, and I don't know the reason for it, I don't know if I could really speculate on it myself, but there weren't a lot of women I didn't feel like there were a lot of women that were really in my corner during my life. I don't know why. It may be just bad luck. But yeah, I just wanted to say that it's definitely not a book about men being abusive. It's a book about a certain few people in power who abuse that power, and they happen to be men. As far as my father, I think he had a struggle at that when he was raising me as a single dad after my mother left. Raising me as a single parent, he just wasn't equipped for it, let's just say. That being said, the good thing about my father is that I never, ever felt that he gave up on me. And I think that's critical as a child in a difficult situation. Even if it's really tough and things aren't going well with your family, if you know your parent hasn't given up on you, that really, really helps, even if they're not doing very well themselves. So I never felt like my dad gave up on me, even if he wasn't taking care of me very well, to be quite honest.
That's really nice. Is he still alive?
He did pass away 3 or 4 years ago, before the pandemic, thank goodness. He didn't have to be an elderly man in the pandemic, which would have been, horrible. It was really the pandemic was so hard on older people. So I'm glad he didn't have to go through that.
And I think there's a panel of him fairly advanced in life when you're an adult in the book, and you sort of hide things from him. So I guess he never knew that you were working on this book.
He never knew I was working on the book. No. I did tell him later in life, as I was going, I didn't tell him I was involved in the legal matter. By the time all this was going on, he was in his late 80s, and he was doing pretty well. He could still rant and rave about politics, and he had a good memory. He was failing physically more than mentally. However,
was he living by himself in New Brunswick?
At this, when he was older?
Yeah, at this stage you're talking about in his late 80s.
Actually, he was living on Gabriola Island. He came out to Gabriola Island after my stepmother passed away. So he came out west, and I sort of kept an eye on him, made sure he was all right. But I didn't want to. Maybe it was selfish on my part. I didn't want to deal with how it would make him feel. It would worry him. I felt that he was physically not doing great. He was definitely frail at that point. And I just didn't want to deal with whatever emotions that he might have related to the legal part. I did tell him what Richard did, because Richard was his friend, which is how this whole thing started with him. I did tell him that, and he was sympathetic, and, he believed me, and he was sympathetic about it. And I think that's, from an elderly parent, I think that I can't really expect too much more than that. He believed me, and he was sympathetic about it. And it really was a time in his life where I just didn't want to get into it too much with him.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It sounds like you've come to peace with many aspects of it, which I admire. You've really kind of gone through the whole journey, once again, which speaks to the thoroughness of your book, which I like so much.
Well, thank you. And I think that that's probably, excuse me, the most important part of the book from my point of view, is the message is you can heal. And I don't know if every single person in the world can heal, but I know that most people can heal. But you do have to find a way to go through it yourself. It could be counseling. It could be talking to your family. It could be talking to your friends. It could be a support group. It could be meditation. For me, it was writing this book that allowed me to go through it and come out the other side. And I feel now that I've done the book that there's no part of the experience that I feel that I have to carry around with me anymore. And I think that's the key, is when this type of thing happens, you carry it around with you all the time, even if you don't know. And in the book, I used, I think it's called a metaphor, I hope we got that right, of the stone, that I'm carrying a stone. And it just stays with you. And I feel now that I'm not carrying that anymore. And it's because it's now literally outside of me in the form of a book. Like, I took the story, I turned it into a book. Now it's separate from me instead of being a part of me. That's not to say that I don't get emotional or upset if I start to dig into certain areas. But it definitely, if I do feel emotional or upset, it doesn't overwhelm me. It doesn't linger with me for more than a few minutes. And I don't think that it's dragging me down. I have a certain amount of grief because I realize there are many things that I missed out on or could have done differently in my life. There's a sense of loss for what you've lost. And, that type of thing you can't really 100% get over. Grief sort of stays with you in some way or another. But the experience itself, I feel like, is now outside of me and done.
Yeah. I think you use a lot of metaphors in your memoir. It's quite rich. One kind of system you use to talk about working through the trauma is the hero's journey. Do you still believe in that as an ideal model to kind of work through the struggle that you're talking about?
The way I wrote this book was a bit different than most books are written, I think. With most books, you start with a plan, some kind of outline or idea. I didn't. So in terms of the hero's journey, I didn't start with the journey in mind. What I started with was more like what Seth described. I think it was a podcast. I haven't listened to it for a while, but it was really good. And Seth was talking about how memory isn't linear. You don't remember things in a linear fashion. You start at a certain point, and then the thing you remember then allows you to jump to something else you've remembered, and that takes you somewhere else. It might jump out a few years in different locations. It's not a linear chronological thing. So
it's funny because I ran a couple of errands before coming back home to be ready for this interview, and one of them was to put a book in the mail to Seth.
Oh, wow.
And I had another little experience on the way to do that with animals. If you remind me, I'll tell you, because I think it pertains to your book. But anyway, continue. Memory, non-linear.
Yes, memory is, Seth, I think, I haven't found anybody who says more fascinating things about writing comics than Seth yet.
He's wonderful.
It's just the things he says are fascinating to me.
He is really wonderful. Yeah. I'm not the only one, but he's really helped a lot of people just, get into comics in one way or another.
Yes, I think it's remarkable, really. So that was the biggest influence on how that podcast and him talking about it was the biggest influence on how I approached this book. So what I did was, it was almost like I deliberately opened a door in my head and said, okay, story, come out. And that became the starting point, similar to what Seth was talking about, is you start at a point and then you see where it takes you. And that was the very first page of the book that when I sort of opened that imaginary door in my head, first the words came to me. The words said, when I think back, what really stands out are the flies. And then the image came after, which was the image of a huge fly on the counter inside the log cabin that my dad eventually built. And that was, a full page. So that was the exact image and the words that came to me. And then from there, I followed them. And then the next words came. And basically, the whole book unraveled in that manner, starting from that one image. And I became kind of concerned partway through the book because I didn't have a storyline. I was simply allowing the story to come out. And, about, a few dozen pages in, or like 100 or so pages in, I'm starting to think, well, what am I going to do with this? Because not only was I telling my story, but I had all these creatures that had appeared. I had a bear, I had wolves and dogs, I had a snake. And I'm thinking, I can't just be dropping all these characters into a story. Oh, and Lady Justice, that was my favorite. She appeared out of nowhere. I was just having the story. I never thought about that. And all of a sudden, Lady Justice has popped in. She's sitting on a stool, drinking a Pepsi or a Coke or something in a glass bottle. Like, I could see the bottle. She had a straw sticking out of it. She's sitting on a stool. It's just this image of Lady Justice. And I'm like, oh man, what am I going to do? I've got all these animals. I've got this real people, imaginary people. How the heck am I going to tie this whole thing together?
Let me just say, I think this approach really works for you, because somebody else might have done this in a very, either they just have tons of panels of themselves talking to the reader, or they just have a very kind of chronicle documentary in real time kind of thing of the event. And it might be really important and interesting in terms of its subject matter, but the actual deployment might not be that different from a ton of other things we've seen. But yours is interesting because it's got this subjective psychological aspect that uses metaphors, uses these animals, especially because animals are important to you, to kind of go in these different directions that I think makes it really interesting. So I think whatever that subconscious approach is, you should continue using it in the future, because I think that's your style.
My thing. I'm going to try, because I think for me that's for myself, that's the key to telling stories. My key to telling the stories for myself. But when you're talking about animals and all the metaphor, that I sort of realized what was happening. I didn't know how I was going to tie the story together, but I realized what was happening because apart from understanding comics, the other main book that influenced me was The Writer's Journey.
By Julia Cameron.
This is The Writer's Journey. It's called, I'm just holding the book in my hand, Mythic Structure for Writers
by
Christopher.
I'm thinking of something else.
Yeah, this one's Christopher Vogler, I think is how you say it. And he talks about how the hero's journey, the main story arc that we get in movies and books, in Western culture, I guess, is also kind of linked to the dream world and to the subconscious. So I felt that if I said, wow, these things are all linked. That means there must be stories in my subconscious and in my mind and in dreams. There must be stories there. And if I can just find them, if I can just find how to get them. So I don't know if that's what I was doing with my process, but I felt like the key to finding stories was to go into your mind, because they're in there somewhere. The mythology and dreams and psychology are all linked. And The Writer's Journey helped me to realize that. So luckily it tied together in the end, but I don't know if that was kind of dumb luck, I think, because I didn't have a plan when I started out. So.
I think sometimes people in books and workshops and things like that, they kind of force the writer's journey, as just like there's supposed to be, like in film scripts, for example, a traditional three-act structure. But that can be kind of limiting too. I think, if you trust your own self to find meanings and connections and stuff, the form will appear kind of like a dream taking form itself, or a flower opening up, or something like that. The hero's journey kind of comes from The Hero of a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell, and it's being kind of debunked a little bit, but I used to be big on that when I was young. Certainly there's a lot of rich connections there, and very lucky, to experience them in life.
Coming up, Emily's mom's reaction to the book, reliving the experience in order to write about it, approaching Drawn and Quarterly with the book idea, and Emily's intended topic for her next book. But first, a reminder to join us for 20th Century TV and music trivia quiz videos and more on our Patreon page. Every month, patrons donating $4 a month or more also get a full-length podcast episode reviewing an issue of The Amazing Spider-Man from the 1960s. Check out all our rewards at patreon.com/deconcomics. If you'd rather give a one-time donation, you can do so via PayPal by sending it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We appreciate your support.
Are you addicted to classic TV shows? Did you spend the 80s sitting in front of the boob tube? Then join us for TV Tangents, where we examine television of the 20th century with barely any contemporary context. Visit Shout Engine, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts, and look for TV Tangents.
Just to go back to your parents, how's your mom reacted to the book?
The honest answer to that is basically for me not to quit my day job. So she when I told her what what Richard did, she just basically said, because she knew Richard too, she worked with Richard at one point, she said that she had always suspected he was a shady character, and that was it. That was it. So, yeah, that's about it.
So when she says don't quit your day job, what she's saying is she didn't think that much of the book herself.
That's one interpretation. Unfortunately, my mother and I aren't that close.
Yeah.
At this
I mean,
point.
I'm the same. I mean, so I totally feel you. I mean, I think being a creative person, that's always a struggle, is to get family to understand why you do something, or to try to see things sort of the way you're seeing them, which is kind of impossible anyway. So I don't even try anymore. But yeah, my parents are kind of similar. But, you just keep on doing it, and then they sort of have to accept it as a fact. It just kind of wears down whatever their reaction is over time, I think.
It is tough. I think that you have to, I shouldn't say have to, but I know for myself to find my creative voice that's in my head, I had to stop listening to the other voices in my head that told me I wasn't good enough or couldn't do it. And some of those voices are the most influential ones are your parents. So if you do have that voice in your head that's your parents telling you you're not good enough, I think for a long time you'll believe it. But eventually, as a creative person, you need to let that creativity out, and you have to set aside those voices in your head that are the people who say that you can't do it. You have to know that you can.
Or you kind of recognize that it's a pattern of thinking, and you can put another pattern of thinking in its place if you just kind of realize that's what it is, and then it's not absolute. You just kind of, it's like picking up railroad tracks and just moving them to a different source or something like that.
Yes.
In your book, I think you do a good job without kind of blaming your parents or attacking your parents, of showing like the lack of warmth or nurturing or support that can be there sometimes. And in some ways, I think that's a British thing. Like, I'm Tamil, but my family lived in England from when I was 4 till 10, and then we moved here in a roundabout way. But what I was wondering is, since your parents seem so British in some ways, that reserve a feeling, or that kind of, British kind of snobbishness, for lack of a better word, why did they move to such a rural area?
Well, it's hard to know exactly, because of course all of this happened before I was born. But from what I understand, and they weren't really very big on sharing much of their personal stuff. My father moved to New Brunswick because he wanted to be a farmer, or wanted to work on a farm. And I think he came to work on a dairy farm in New Brunswick back in, I don't know, maybe it could have been the 1950s or 60s. I'm not even really sure. And then my mother followed afterwards. So, and then being in the Maritimes, it ended up that my mother took us to Prince Edward Island from New Brunswick, which is pretty close. It's 2 or 3 hours drive away, and you get on at that time a ferry, and then you're on Prince Edward Island. Similar culture, similar, not exactly the same, rural type of area. So it's just kind of where we ended up. My dad once said that he thought about moving, but he wanted me to grow up in the same place to have a sense of home. So, and I appreciate that, because the Maritimes are an excellent place to be from. It's a safe, lots of bad things happen, but overall it's a pretty safe place, and a pretty tight-knit community, and people look out for each other.
Right. Just on the topic of women, on page 102, if you want to take a look in your book,
okay,
you have And this is the period when you're reflecting on Richard still abusing you, but now he's involved with Lily, who's not his primary or his first girlfriend. And she seems kind of aware of Richard's abuse of you because Richard tells you that Lily is very special and that you're not as good as she is. You're not half as good. I said, I love you. Doesn't that mean anything to you? And he's saying all of this, don't you know what love is, to you while Lily is sitting on his lap. So Lily would have been aware.
Well, it's hard to know. Keep in mind, I just turned, no, I wasn't even, was I 15? Yeah, I just turned 15 at this point. So as a 15-year-old, you don't always know what adults are thinking. And as far as the wording, you might think to yourself, well, did they say that? And the answer is yes, because all of the dialogue related to Richard that I put in my book, I decided it wasn't fair of me to him. As much as I didn't like what he did, and I don't like him, I thought it wasn't fair to misrepresent him. So that all of the dialogue, all these words come from the diaries that I wrote at the time this happened. So it's not me remembering it decades later. This is me remembering it, a day later and writing it in my diary. The other thing to consider is in this particular part of the book, what we're talking about, they were both absolutely drunk out of their minds. So I don't even know if they remembered that conversation. Honestly, they were that drunk they might not have remembered. Richard more than Lily, but I don't know if Lily knew what was going on or not. As far as I knew, there was only one person that at that time knew what was going on, and that was the fellow who, oh gosh, now I don't know which page it's on, but his...
It's when he sees Richard and then actually says something, and then Richard pisses on his tires.
That's right. That is, as far as I know, the only adult who knew who suspected what was going on at that time. And even at that moment, when Steve mentions something to Richard, they were also completely drunk out of their minds and may not have even remembered that conversation the next day, let alone decades later. So I don't... Richard's girlfriend at the time, not Lily, but the other person, she didn't know what was going on. I know that for sure because I talked to her about it. She had no idea. I talked to her about it years later. And I don't know if Lily knew. The only person who I know for sure knew was Steve.
Have you changed the names of Richard, Lily, Steve, and others?
I did a bit of soul searching with that. And what I decided is this is not a book to attempt to hurt Richard. It's a book to bear witness to what happened, to tell my story, because at one point he told me it's our little secret, which is where the title of the book comes from. So my goal is for it not to be my little secret anymore. And to do that, I had to use his real name. I did tell the publisher this. They were okay with that. And I am extremely grateful for that, because if they had said, no, you cannot use his real name, I would have still felt a part of the story burdening me. It would still be a burden. It would still be a secret. I thought, as I went through the years, I wondered what it would take for me to feel like it was over. To finally get rid of the thing that I carried around with me. And for me, that was to be able to tell my story using his real name. That was what it took, because then it's not our little secret anymore. Then it's that part is so important. The other people I talked to individually. I didn't talk to Lily. Just too awkward. All of the other people I did talk to about using their names, and my best friend was fine. Her name is Kathy. She's fine with me. She wanted me to use her real name, so I did. The other people I asked preferred that I didn't use their real names. And the lawyer, I changed his name and his look. Again,
Gotcha.
as much as I was extremely angry with him, that's not really what the book was about. So it wasn't really necessary to use his name and image, but it was necessary for me to feel the story was completely out to use Richard's real name. I didn't use his last name. That's fine. I'm not trying to identify him. I just want to use his name and not be silenced.
The parts that deal most directly with the abuse, were they harder to draw than the other parts, or were they easier because, like you say, it allowed you to finally liberate that secret and that burden, that stone?
The parts of the abuse were extremely difficult and disturbing to draw. I'll be honest with you, because what I had to do to tell the story, this wasn't, like I said, it wasn't a story where I jotted down the outline of the story and then I filled it in. This is a story where I went someplace in my head, don't know where, and went through the whole thing. When I got to the parts of the abuse, it wasn't that it wasn't that I was telling the story, it was that I was reliving it. So in order for me to draw the story, I had to go into my head and experience everything over again. And I don't know if you noticed, but in the first section, I'm just opening up my book here and seeing where it first starts. In the first section, I'm talking a little bit about stuff that, all these thoughts that come to me after when I say, in the very first start of the book, I say, I'm just finding the page here. I don't want to misquote myself. I say, when I look back, what really stands out are the flies. They were epic. Okay, so then the next few pages, I'm just thinking about some random memories, jumping around a bit, kind of thinking about what Seth said about how memory jumps from one thing to the other. And then after a few pages, it gets to, I say, I was living in pretty deplorable conditions at my dad's place. And I say, how does that compare to, and I'm just reading here, Richard repeatedly abusing me when I was 15 and he was 40, and the alcohol provided. So when I do those drawings on page 16, I draw his face and his head just as a series of squiggles, because it was too difficult for me to draw his image. All I did was just kind of scribbled on the page where his head was, because it was too difficult to draw. And it took quite a while going through the book. I don't know how many pages, but it's quite a while later in the book when I finally start to draw my representation of Richard. But at the very start, it was too much. It really was as if I was reliving things, almost having sensory experiences. The most difficult, and I suppose, it's difficult to talk about, but for me, it's more difficult to stay silent. And I think my message is that whatever anybody's going through, talking about it is better than carrying it with you. Carrying it with you is worse. So the sensory things that I experienced were like flashbacks. And I want to talk about it openly because it's important to talk about it openly. Any kind of trauma, eventually, when you're comfortable with it. I felt the shower water kind of on me as I was remembering it. I could feel the things that were happening and remember. And as difficult as it was, it helped me for a couple of reasons. It made me realize it was real, even though it was in my diary and I'd written it all down. When I went back to remember it, it was real. It happened. This is how it felt. This is why it was so difficult. This is how terrified I felt. This is and you remember the shower curtain, the shape of the bathtub, the way things felt. And after that, that part of it was extremely difficult, but so important, because I had to go, for me, it's going to be different for everyone, I imagine, but I had to go through it as if it was happening to me again in order to process it. So yeah, it was pretty tough. And the other really tough part was I did this on my own. This was partly during the pandemic that all this was going on. I didn't have anybody close in my family I could talk to. And I had terrible luck trying to find a counselor to help me go through this. They wanted to fix me. The counselors I talked to wanted to fix me. I'm like, no, I got to write this book. I got to go through this stuff. It's going to be difficult. I need someone to help me. And they weren't getting it. So I ended up going through this whole thing by myself. And the risk I took was, at the beginning, I didn't know if I was going to psychologically survive this process. I had to just jump in and see what happened. Luckily, I did. And I think that's an important message, too, is that sometimes when you face something, it seems so daunting that you don't know if you're going to survive it mentally and emotionally. But then you do. You go through it and you do survive, and you become, I won't say stronger. I don't think the goal is to become stronger. I think the goal is to become whole and complete and the real person you were meant to be, not the damaged person. But the fear of going through it holds you back. But I came to a point where I couldn't contain the story anymore. And even though I had no support from my family, some support from my friends, but I can't unload all of this on them. It's just too much to process. And no support from a counselor at the time. I still did make it through, and it was definitely worth it. I don't regret a single thing about it.
Yeah, it's a very powerful book. It really is. And I think you did an amazing job. And it's not about how good the drawing is or how sophisticated the comics craft is. That's all fine. It's just about the way it comes together. And like I say, when I read Ducks, I don't know, back in the fall or whatever, there's those instances of sexual predation or abuse. And they're just, and people weren't talking about that. They were talking about the oil sands. But to me, that's what was at the heart of the book. And I've just remembered, you mentioned Blankets earlier in the interview. There's this moment in Blankets when they're kids and there's a bigger kid who's a babysitter, and there's a moment of sexual abuse there. And he doesn't really address that. And I remember saying to people, like, isn't that really weird? But what your book does, like the book you mentioned that's not a graphic novel that really inspired you, is it really unpacks it so well, and that's its strength. It doesn't just recount or document it, but it does that really well. I mean, the other thing that you have in common with Craig Thompson of Blankets fame is working on the farm as a kid. He talks about the ginseng farming and his family and kind of some of the, the stresses and the dysfunctions there. So you've done this really brave thing. You worked on the book solo. You finished it. Was D&Q the first place that you wanted to submit it to? What was it like submitting it? And did Peggy and Tom just welcome it immediately, or did they have reservations? Did they want you to work on it some more? What was that like?
Well, it was, I at the time the story came out, I just needed to get the story out. But then once the story was out, my goal became to try to use my story as a tool to help people understand, whether they've been abused or not, what's going on, how it starts, because I think almost anybody who can read my story will learn something. So I wanted to publish it. So I went to the library and I looked in the graphic novel section, and being relatively new to graphic novels, I looked through them and I saw these look like nice books. These look like nice books. And, and I just picked the books that, this publisher seems to publish a lot of books that resonate with me. So that was Drawn and Quarterly. And I said, I'll try them first. So I just went on the website. I followed the directions, submitted a portion. At this point, it was just the initial pencil sketches of the story just initially coming out as I went through and drew it without a script or anything. So I submitted, I don't remember, I think it might have been 30 or 40 pages of that. And I heard back from them in about a week and said they were interested.
That's amazing.
They didn't say they were 100% sure. They said, I think we're interested, but you got to give us a few months. So
sure.
There wasn't much change, not much change in the story. How it was presented, they had some good ideas about how to break up the sections differently than I did. They had a few visual things they suggested, but mainly it was the same story.
And was it Tom or Peggy or somebody else who was communicating with you?
Mostly Tom. Mostly Tom as far as the editing part, Tom Devlin. And then dealing with other parts, because of, the publishers have different people working in different areas. So I would talk to other people as well, regarding different aspects of producing the book. And they were all great. They allowed me to tell the story more or less the way I wanted, which is very important too, because if it had been changed, it wouldn't have been my story anymore. And I didn't want to carry anything with me of this whole thing anymore. So they allowed anything that was really important for me to put in, they allowed me to keep in. And then going through the publishing process the first time, I just I'm like, you guys are the pros. I got this thing. Just do your book thing. I have no idea how this works. So just tell me what to do. They were great. They got the book out fairly quickly. And I'm extremely grateful for them. And I think I'm very happy with how the book looks as an object. I think they make beautiful books. Yeah,
and they are really, they and Fantagraphics are the premier publishers of indie books, right? Indie comics.
I sort of felt like I won some kind of lottery, actually.
yeah. I mean, that is really a fantastic story, and you deserve it for sure. What's next? And is there talk with D&Q of them doing your next book?
I hope they do my next book. I really like to work with them. My next book is, I've submitted kind of the idea and the rough outline for them to think over. My next book, I guess you could technically call it a memoir, but it's kind of a memoir / biography. It's a story about a friend of mine who lives a very interesting lifestyle. He lives without any amenities, so no running water, no electricity, no power, no internet, no phone. He works. He's a carpenter, and when he saves up enough money, he goes to Mexico and he surfs all winter. And he's really into literature, like reading all these Russian giants and books that I can't even get through one page. So really smart guy. And it's hard to describe the book, but it's mostly, I would say, the book is about art itself. It's about art. It's about creativity. It's about how much freedom individuals have in society, how much we're actually allowed to do. And it's set partly in the pandemic. So the pandemic is when, I think for most of us, we've had the most rules imposed on us of our entire lives. So that was an experience in itself. And it's kind of a book about freedom set in the pandemic. It's a bit hard to describe, but partly the reason it's hard to describe, I think, is because I'm trying to approach it a little bit like my first book and try to find the place in my head where the story tells itself. So I haven't fully defined it. I'm trying to allow as much of the story to tell itself as it can.
So is it going to be another book that's about an issue, in this case, freedom and the pandemic, or is it more of a narrative, more of a, you know?
It's a bit of both things. My first book, Our Little Secret, I feel my little secret is where the pain of my memories meet the beautiful things in my memories. It's the place where those things meet. So I have these, bucolic moments where I'm riding my horse and the trees are beautiful and this farmland and lots of happy memories and painful memories side by side in one book. My second book is going to be, and this is just how it evolved, comedy and tragedy, where comedy and tragedy meet. So there are a lot of really funny things that happen in this book. I had to cut a lot of them out because it just became too much. I started with about 450 pages and now it's down to about under 300. So, but there's tragedy and there's some tragic things happen in the book, which I won't go into because I think it'd be like a spoiler alert type of thing. But there's tragic things happen. And hilarious things happen, and the story kind of happens where those things meet. And this goes back, strangely enough, for me, to when I was a very, very, very young child, like maybe, not like very young, but, 8 or 9, maybe. My parents, being British intellectual types, taught us to read really early and kind of steered us away from American culture. They just weren't into it. And so I would be reading things like Oscar Wilde's children's stories. And the book about the selfish giant. Have you ever read that story, The Selfish Giant?
Yeah, I love Oscar Wilde. Yeah, that's from his collection of fairy tales.
And I was very, very young when I read that. I was able to read it myself. And I remember thinking as a little kid how beautiful and tragic that story was. And how Oscar Wilde had kind of mashed those two things together. Intense beauty and intense sadness into one story. And it might sound like a strange thing, but I realized, even when I was that age, that is how you make a good book. Is you take, and I mean, there's lots of good books, and I was only a little kid, but but at that time, I thought this is how you make a good book. You take two things that are the opposite, and you put them together, and opposite emotions, and you put them together, and that's where you get a good book. So I still actually believe that, and that's sort of the thing is my next book will kind of be tragedy and comedy, and then the story. It will be in issues. It will be about homelessness, freedom, art, a lot of weighty topics, kind of disguised in this with this kind of comedic overlay, you might say.
Yeah, intellectuals look at it as thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis. So I don't know if that's
you
helpful.
It's a real thing.
But yeah, no, or just tensions make for electricity or life, in work. That's a great place to stop, unless there's anything else you want to say before we wrap up.
Well, I'd like to say thank you for really interesting questions, really interesting and thoughtful questions. The only thing else I'd like to say is I really would encourage anybody who's been through trauma to find a way to safely face it, with the proper support, because I don't know if everybody can heal, but I know everybody can make a massive forward gain. And don't wall yourself off from the experience and bury it. Find a safe way to go through it. It's extremely important, is the last thing I'd have to say. Okay, great.
Our Little Secret by Emily Carrington is published by Drawn and Quarterly. You can help the Deconstructing Comics family of podcasts by joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/deconcomics. And go to deconstructingcomics.com to connect to us on Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube, to shop on Amazon to support the show, and to find links to subscribe to the podcast. You can comment on any episode there, or drop us a line at mail@deconstructingcomics.com. That's also the address for submitting your own comics work for possible inclusion in our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Our theme is by J.B. Anderton. Next week, Emmett and I are back with the 5th installment of our look at Jack Kirby's original series of Commandy, the Last Boy on Earth. We'll cover issues 29 through 34, which include a naval battle, an alien in a flying saucer, and the red-caped costume of a certain iconic hero. That's next week. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.